Hello and welcome. Thanks so much for joining me today. And thank you to the Theosophical Society for hosting me in this presentation. I'm really glad to be here. So let's jump right in. So as a young child, I found myself asking questions such as, who am I and where am I? Later in life, these questions deepened and evolved, opening up the landscape of my spiritual path and journey. Some of what I've discovered in the process falls under what I think of three broad categories of self-discovery, inner guidance, and spiritual growth. All three can be viewed within the context of a cosmic framework, which we'll get into in just a moment. But let's briefly break down what we mean by these three categories. Self-discovery, I believe, is the path we take in answering the question that I'm sure most of us have asked at one point or another: who am I? This question encompasses what is my purpose. Inner guidance, then, is the inner voice that we awaken to that helps guide us along the journey of self-discovery. I also think of this inner guidance as the higher self or the core self. And third is spiritual growth, which we could say is the outcome as we continue to remain curious and open. The more open and receptive we are to life's lessons, the more the path flows with ease. Naturally, we learn and evolve, contributing to our own and the universe's expansion. When we begin the endeavor to answer the questions, who am I and what's my purpose, we naturally look for a way to make meaning out of our experience. This is at the heart of a lifelong journey, and I believe of all spiritual seeking. Human beings have been searching for millennia to many of the still unanswered questions about our universe. A cosmic framework offers us a worldview, or in this context, a spiritual worldview, and a path for spiritual growth and development. More importantly, any framework we choose is ultimately a map for our orientation and navigation. That is, what best guides us to discovering who we are. As we present this framework, keep in mind that it's only a view, one view out of many, many possibilities. In other words, no truth is absolute. So if we ask the next question, which is, what exactly is the navigation system? We come to realize that we already have an inbuilt compass and inner guidance system. I think of this in part as the wisdom of the soul, but we also have instruments of perception and vehicles for consciousness. As Annie Besant believed that with the development of consciousness and fine-tuning of the inner instruments of perception, a student could explore these subtle bodies for themselves. Essentially, Besant is pointing out that we are not limited to just our physical senses and physical body. We have an outer and inner reality, and with an understanding and orientation of what that is, we can navigate our lives with greater ease, flexibility, and joy. Simultaneously, we discover who we are and our purpose. And as you'll see later on, we'll look at what the subtle bodies and instruments of perception are. But before we dive into the cosmic framework, I'd like to take a step back and first examine one of the three categories we just identified a moment ago, namely self-discovery. Self-discovery encompasses the questions, who am I and what is my purpose? If we move beyond our definition of self as the container of our physical body, the natural question arises, if I'm not my body, then what or who am I? As we extrapolate the question, we might say, if I'm not my body and I'm not my emotions, then I'm not my mind, and so forth. And then we're left with something non-material. In other words, the conditioned thinking of self begins to fall away. I think of our substrate consciousness as energy, expressed as a soul, which eventually manifests, or rather is projected into physical form. Although energy is neutral, it's imbued with properties of matter, some of which are the 5 elements found in nature: earth, water, air, fire, and space. As the framework unfolds, we'll have a better understanding of where we fit in within that context, providing, I believe, a clearer map and understanding for the course of moving forward in our self-discovery and development. The elements themselves are related to the subtle bodies, the bodies being vehicles of consciousness. Through these vehicles of consciousness, we express ourselves, our energy and essence, and navigate between physical and non-physical reality through the physical and subtle bodies. Although there are more bodies beyond this, we focus on the 5 beyond the physical as etheric, astral or emotional, mental, and causal, and lastly, Buddhic. Instruments of perception are part of navigating, processing sensory information, and learning through the inner and outer senses. We'll touch on those a little bit later on, where we see how they fit within this cosmic framework. So the second part of self-discovery is related to who am I and what is my purpose. It's my belief and understanding that we live in a universe that is based on the principle of learning and growth. It's a participatory and interdependent system in which we each express our unique master plan for learning and growth. And in the process, we continue to evolve and grow across many lifetimes. We integrate the lessons of each lifetime as we move between physical and non-physical reality, crossing the boundary of form and formlessness. Each lifetime is an unfolding of each person's unique master plan for learning and growth. One of the key challenges, though, is remembering the essence of who you are. So we could say that the process of remembering or self-remembering, which happens across lifetimes, exists at the boundary between the true self and the false self. As we'll see in the unfolding of a universe, knowing and understanding this boundary, so to speak, is part of the self-discovery process. It's part of spiritual growth and working consciously with our inner guidance system. I think of the true self as energy, the soul, and on the other hand, the false self is the I maker, the ego personality that we identify with, in which we reify the idea of selfhood. This is the conditioned thinking and ideas we have of ourselves. Our modern lives heavily emphasize identifying with form. I'm a teacher, I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, etc. This is conditioned thinking of the self. One of the most challenging spiritual and life lessons then is realizing the nature of the true self, which is energy, and as energy, it's formless. Second is learning to transcend the need to identify with this false self, the ego personality, which is really just a label and a form. Essentially, it's a lesson of moving into and out of form. When we're connected to this true self, we're in touch with our inner guidance system. Said another way, we're leading with the illumination and wisdom of the soul. It's one of our tasks, like a prime directive, to remember this. As we'll see, various principles and stages within the framework provide the mechanisms for us to discover our true self, which is naturally joyful, radiant, and harmonious. So a cosmic framework is really a theory of a beginning, a blueprint of material and non-material reality. We're going to highlight just some of the 36 principles that are most salient for today's presentation, beginning from the top down, so to speak. For our purposes, this simply makes conceptualizing the unfolding process easier. We can think of it as a process of moving into and out of form, or the movement from subtle matter to dense matter, and back and forth in an interplay of manifestation, sustained form, and gradual dissolution back into a formless state. As we begin with the least material form of matter, it's often the hardest to conceptualize as we spend so much of our waking conscious time focused on the things we can see, feel, hear, taste, and touch with our physical senses. So I invite you to use your mind's faculty of imagination to bring alive these concepts inwardly and to use your inner felt sense of things to feel into the words and the concepts as you construct your own understanding of the material. Remember what we said a little while ago, no truth is absolute. So what is true for one person may not be true for another. In other words, a framework is just a view, and there are many, many perspectives and many views within the spectrum of consciousness. This is just one view. So my interest in what I'll call a spiritual map of the universe eventually led me to the canon of Vedic teaching and philosophies, specifically a non-dual view of reality. I was specifically interested in a framework that evolved in the Shaivite lineage of Kashmir. One of the core teachings in this system is called the Doctrine of Recognition, written between the 8th and 11th centuries AD. Not only does it lay out a metaphysical map of manifestation unfolding, it also outlines the idea of who or what has been forgotten and a process for remembering, that is, self-remembering. So if we break down the word recognition, we can see that it refers to not only recognizing something, in this case the self, but also to recognize, to re-remember. So recall from earlier that one of the categories we're looking at is self-discovery. So we have here a metaphysical framework that points to just such a path for us to rediscover ourselves. In a non-dual view, everything is happening within the world process, within the womb of the universe. In other words, we're not separate from, but rather part of everything. As we learn and grow, we contribute to the expansion and growth of the universe itself. So if we start at the beginning of a universe unfolding, we could say there exists the idea of an ultimate reality that permeates and upholds what we know and think of as our universe. I refer to this simply as the source, but many other similar or comparable names include Logos, the divine, God, supreme consciousness, or supreme spirit. They all point to the unifying principle of this ultimate reality, the source. In emanating a universe, the initial outpouring is a manifestation of 3 expressions of consciousness. And as the process of unfolding continues, I think of this as 4 stages. 1, the world unfolds and manifests, but is still hidden or veiled. The unlimited powers of the source are limited and contained within us. And the individual spirit or soul begins to take form. And then in the 4th stage, manifestation of embodied physical form through the subtle bodies and 5 elements takes place. Each stage is defined by one or more particular principles. In Sanskrit, it's called a tattva, which I define as the thatness of something or the essential nature of something. In other words, we can think of it simply as the property of matter. Each principle expresses and governs a particular aspect of reality, which informs our experiences of ourselves in both physical and non-physical terms. I believe that by understanding these principles, we may gain deeper insight into the nature of our reality. And with that understanding, we're better equipped to navigate life with greater clarity, non-judgment, and compassion for ourselves and others. Examining this metaphysical framework, I believe, is thus actually in alignment with one of the founding principles of theosophy, to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. So let's take a closer look at what those might be. As the source emanates and unfolds a universe, we see the beginning of a world process. Annie Besant refers to this as a triplicity of manifestation, or what could be thought of as we said a moment ago, 3 expressions of consciousness. Besant describes these 3 expressions of consciousness as will, related to the source, wisdom, related to the concept Shiva, and activity, Shakti. The relationship of these principles is reflected in the experience of each individual unit of consciousness. So what do I mean by this? Another way we can think about these 3 expressions of consciousness is what they represent within each of us. So we have the self, which means who we are. And we can think of this as the inner voice of, I am this. We have the not self, who we aren't. And that inner voice is, I am not this. And the relationship between these 2 states is the pure I, or really consciousness beyond duality. When we integrate the lesson of both the self and the not self, we transcend the idea of separation and realize really the ultimate bliss of our being. But to get there, we have to work through the world of material form. And as Annie Besant says, always it is life, consciousness, seeking to realize itself in matter, and matter responding in virtue of its own inherent qualities. In other words, we create our own reality and are imbued with the power to do so. But rather than being given absolute carte blanche, there are limits put in place which facilitate the experience of learning and growth. Part of our work is to realize the power inherent within us, the profundity of the energy within, and to learn how to harness that energy, not just for personal gain, but rather for the greater good of all. This is the lesson of learning to be in service to self, service to others, and service to the source. When we look at being of service for the greater good of all, we can see how this belief, value, and attitude contributes to spiritual growth, our 3rd category. So service to self is the recognition that the plan for our learning and growth is set at the highest level of our being. Our task in each lifetime is to self-remember, to live in alignment with our soul and in alignment with our life's purpose, which is a path that is unique to each person. Rather than resisting our growth, we can work in cooperation with the highest level of our being to live, learn, and grow with more joy and satisfaction rather than pain and suffering. Service to others is the role we play in cultivating values and attitudes that I believe are universal: compassion, tolerance, non-harming, forgiveness, and empathetic joy. The question of service to others extends also to nature and to other sentient beings, and to the beings that are present in non-physical reality, with whom we are invited to collaborate and cooperate with. Service to the source or the universe is the invitation to be in harmony with all levels of being, devoted to being an agent of flow that contributes to that harmony. So keep this in mind when we look at the stage of differentiation related to the gunas, this lesson of being of service. As we now reach the stage where we could say that a soul comes into being, I think of this stage as the beginning of differentiation. And we have what are called the 3 gunas and the subject-object relationship. Let's look at the gunas first. Guna is a Sanskrit term, and it means an aspect of or property of matter, matter being the substance of existence. We can think of the gunas as 3 modes of matter creating reality. Following Annie Besant's definitions, we see that we have sattva represents matter as rhythm, vibration, and harmony. Rajas represents matter as mobility and action. And tamas represents matter as inertia, calm, and stability. The gunas exist initially in a state of equilibrium. When this equilibrium is disturbed to create a unique individual spirit or soul, the three modes manifest in various permutations. The permutations are combinations, which producing what Annie Besant calls a septonate. What she means by that is we have 7 groups within which reflect greater or lesser expressions of each of the gunas. So, for example, you might have a combination where rajas is dominant, with sattva and tamas equally subordinate or less influential. However, regardless of the combinations, we can simply ask ourselves the question, what can we learn from each guna such that we can balance and harmonize these energies within ourselves? So if we think of sattva as representing the energy of harmony, we could then imagine that harmony as the principle of right knowledge. If we ask ourselves a question, am I acting in the service of the greater good of all, including myself? In essence, we attune ourselves at every level of our being to work towards harmony and service of self, others, and the universe. This question invites us into a state of mind in which we have a higher perspective, which can lead to a greater understanding of the forces in play, and where we are better able to see what the next best step is. This is in alignment, for example, with a universal value of non-harming. When we operate with an intention of harmony, it's possible to reduce the extent to which more karma is created, which is one aspect of self-liberation. If we think of rajas as representing the energy of mobility, we could then imagine that mobility as the principle of right action. Asking a question of ourselves, am I living in alignment with the call to act from the soul? When we live in full alignment with the soul, we're living from the experience of flow-based living. Not only is this possible, it's joyful, as the energy of the soul is pure, radiant energy, free of conditioned thinking and limitations. When we act from a call from our higher selves, we're not only in alignment with the needs of our soul, but we're also able to act according to the needs of the universe with clear intention and clear motivation. In other words, instead of doing something because of a should, you do something because there's a higher calling in alignment with higher ideals and values. And lastly, if we think of tamas as representing the energy of stability, we could then imagine that stability as the principle of right desire. As a question, we can ask ourselves, are my actions in alignment with my dharma and the dharma of the universe? In essence, we are responding to the call to grow. The more we are open to change with a willingness to learn and grow, not resisting our growth, the easier it becomes to align personal intentions with universal intentions. Resistance to growth diminishes the flow of life force, whereas embracing the conditions of our growth offers us limitless energy to face the challenges as we're supported internally and externally from above. So as we continue to examine the stage as the beginning of differentiation, remember how earlier we described the triplicity of manifestation as will, wisdom, and activity. We now see it here in this later stage in individual consciousness. We can think of the subject as witness, with the other side of the experience, that of the object or participant. Another way to think of the subject-object relationship is that it's the shifting of awareness between I am this or that versus I am not this or that. In meditation, for example, a beginner learns to refine their awareness, recognizing these two states of experience clearly. And eventually, the subject-object relationship falls away, the practitioner realizing the non-dual awareness of being. We transcend the world of separation and realize that all things are interconnected and interdependent. we are part of everything, and everything is part of us. A key lesson in living from a place of balance and harmony is dissolving the veil of separation, the idea of a separate self. When our primary focus is not just self-centered, but also all-centered, we move from being less selfish to more selfless. Working to balance the gunas within us, we may therefore cultivate compassion for ourselves and others. Never is this more poignant than the stage of trying to figure out who we are and who we're not. So if you remember what we said earlier, the nature of the individual is energy expressed through physical form. The next question then is, how would we convert that energy into a form that functions in physical reality? If we start by thinking beyond the physical body, we can imagine that every individual is a multidimensional being, formed of the weaving together of a higher intellect, mind, ego personality, physical body and subtle bodies, formed of, amongst other properties, the 5 elements. In other words, we have vehicles for consciousness, which themselves are energy, to express itself in both physical and non-physical reality. Through these vehicles of consciousness, we learn and grow. If you imagine, for example, learning to ride a bicycle or a car, or maybe you've learned to sail a boat or fly a plane, either way, becoming proficient in controlling the mode of transport requires understanding how it works, your relationship to it, and how to work with the vehicle in order to navigate your charted course. So let's examine what these vehicles are for consciousness and how we might then gain deeper insight and understanding into ourselves. So what does the soul, which is energy, use to direct itself in physical or material reality and communicate needs, ideas, thoughts, feelings, and so forth? One way in which communication and direction occurs is through 3 modes of mind. We have a higher mind, in Sanskrit called buddhi. Another way I think of this is wisdom mind. We have an ego personality, in Sanskrit called ahamkara. This is the fabricated or false self. It's the I maker, and it's false because it believes itself to be the real self. And then we have a lower mind, in Sanskrit called manas. Another way I think of this is the sensory mind. It processes subjective reality, which is experienced as feelings and emotions. As you look at these 3 modes, try to keep in mind that these, with many of the other modes we look at, may appear as a hierarchy, but these are just artificial delineations that are meant to help organize our thinking. I'd like us to expand on these 3 modes for a moment, because the places where we most often get stuck is the ways in which we engage with limited thinking and beliefs, overly identifying with and becoming enmeshed with our emotions, and identifying with the reifying self, the ego personality. By understanding these aspects of ourselves, we can learn to transcend the areas where we tend to get stuck and instead harness the power of our higher mind and soul, which is wisdom mind. So the role, so to speak, of wisdom mind is that buddhi is a psycho-spiritual assembly of wisdom, intuition, discernment, and insight. When we allow the light of the soul's wisdom to shine through, we cut through illusion to see the nature of reality as it is. With the soul's guidance, we're more supported in our daily lives, we experience more flow, and life force increases. A natural outcome of this is the feeling of satisfaction and fulfillment, which leads to the feeling of harmony and joy. How do we cultivate this in practical terms? It begins with training the senses of perception. It also means that we learn to distinguish between the ego personality, which is the false self, and the guidance of the soul, which is the true self. Part of making this distinction comes from the desire to know oneself more deeply, which often begins the cycle of self-remembering. As we said, this is part of self-discovery and spiritual growth. It also means we learn to navigate the vehicles of consciousness with understanding and discernment. And one of the first steps is knowing what those vehicles are, the subtle bodies, and what they represent. The ego personality is like a five-star general in the captain's army. Its function is to drive action on the physical plane. The difficulty arises when the general resists the commands of the captain, the soul, and instead wants to be in charge. One of our tasks with respect to the ego personality is to realize the role it plays in our learning and growth, and to work with the drive and energy it provides as we navigate life's lessons. In other words, we need to utilize a certain amount of personal will, serious effort, to harness the power of wisdom mind and to hold the reins of what is often a runaway train when we allow the ego and sensory mind to be in charge. The role of the sensory mind is to simply synthesize information, to process it and organize it into categories. This is helpful when we are trying to also store information or make comparisons. The sensory mind works through the senses of perception. One of the ways we become stuck in sensory mind is what I call polarized thinking. This means having strong likes or dislikes, which either emphasize the things we desire and crave or the things we fear and avoid. Quick tip for one way to work with overcoming strong likes and dislikes is perhaps a little exercise you can do. Next time you find yourself in an ice cream shop, try to notice your natural impulses. Do you find yourself drawn to a flavor that's unusual? Do you accept that impulse or ignore it in favor of something you always choose, like vanilla? Do you find yourself looking at the options and mentally listing all the flavors you don't like, even if they're ones you've never tried? Maybe you dip your toes into trying something new and see what kinds of new experiences that opens up for you. But before you decide to run out and grab an ice cream, stay with me for just a little bit longer. As we once again look at how the soul communicates, it uses instruments and principles of sense experience. In Sanskrit, these are called tanmatras, which are the 5 subtle elements. From these 5 subtle elements, we have the 5 senses, the 5 powers of action, and the 5 general objects of perception. I'll repeat that. We have from the 5 subtle elements, the 5 senses, the 5 powers of action, and the 5 general objects of perception. Because we experience reality in both the subtle non-material realm and the dense material realm, our senses of perception need to be able to operate in both these planes of existence. So you could think of these, as I do, as inner and outer senses of perception. And if we can cast your mind back to the beginning of the presentation where we looked at the triplicity of manifestation as will, wisdom, and activity, then how that shows up on the physical plane through the physical and subtle body is the following. In the principle of will, it's related to the motor organs or action, which in Sanskrit is karmendriyas. If we look at the root karma, we see the principle of cause and effect operating here. In other words, one level at which the wheel of cause and effect is set into motion is through the action senses on the physical plane. The motor organs, hands, feet, larynx, and organs of generation and excretion. The principle of activity is related to the organs of perception, which in Sanskrit is jnana-indriyas. The root jna is to know. Here we have knowledge senses by which knowledge is obtained. And this happens through the 5 sense organs, which correspond to the 5 powers of perception. That is, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and feeling. And then our third principle of wisdom is related to the cerebral hemispheres, which is cognition. We can think of this, for example, as awareness, reasoning, and neural activity. So in this table, we can see that each of the senses are related to an element. What this means is that certain qualities of energy are expressed in particular ways. For most of us, the majority of our time is spent focusing on the outer senses and our waking conscious experience. But we have access to a much greater world of information when we use our inner senses to perceive energy, information, and consciousness. Our inner senses help us tap into non-material reality, whether it's in waking consciousness, meditation, or the dream state. To truly see the world in all its technicolor beauty means developing and utilizing both our outer and inner senses. So, for example, we can imagine these inner senses as intuition. Intuition is like a gut feeling, an inner knowing that's not intellectual, a tingling or a physical sensation that alerts you to something. It could also be feeling into something. Our modern lives tend to emphasize thinking into experience rather than feeling into. But our felt senses are more nuanced and don't rely on only analyzing information. Listening with your heart. In other words, empathy, feeling into the experience of the other as if you had stepped inside a painting and were observing the landscape as the first person. Seeing with the eyes of your soul. This is bringing the light and illumination that comes from a higher point of view into your perspective. It's also a level of experience where we can tune into the field of non-physical consciousness, not just our own, but others, in the mass consciousness and of non-physical beings. In hearing non-physical sounds, flavors, temperatures. Think of, for example, if you've ever walked into a room where the physical ambient temperature was warm, but the room felt energetically cold. Inner senses are available to everyone. You access them now. You can access them now right where you are. And the way to activate them is really by tuning or turning your awareness in their direction and being open to the insight and wisdom that they may offer to you. So we're about to cross the metaphysical bridge between the realm of physical and non-physical reality as we next look at the 5 elements and the subtle bodies. Here, we're on the cusp of the energy of the soul and life operating in physical reality in both physical and non-physical terms. Remember that as vehicles of our consciousness, they are containers which help us navigate, learn, grow, and self-remember. As we look at the subtle bodies, it should be understood that there is not so much as a hierarchy as there is a layering where the bodies interpenetrate one another. The elements manifest from most subtle or least material to least subtle, most dense. But again, each is contained within the other. The 5 elements are earth, water, air, fire, and space. Some teachings may also refer to space as ether. The elements correspond to the subtle bodies, in Sanskrit called koshas. I use the nomenclature and classification in Theosophical teaching, which is a physical body, an etheric body, an astral or emotional body, a mental or mind body, a causal body, and a Buddhic body. Even though each element stands on its own, so to speak, they each contain a portion of the other within them. So for example, earth is not just earth, it's also earth which contains water. Think, for example, of how streams, rivers, and lakes are held by the ground. So when we're working with the elements and the bodies, we're never entirely working with just one on its own. This brings us to an important question, however, and that is what key lessons to each of the elements and the subtle bodies offer us. Knowing which body, so to speak, that we're in or operating from, as well as the element or elements that governs their function, we have greater insight into mastering our focus and direction, as well as understanding the areas where we get stuck and out of balance, and what we might need to do in order to return to a state of ideal flow. As we look at Earth, it represents physical embodiment and vitality, part of the physical and etheric body. Water represents easeful flow with experience, with emotions, and dreams, the astral body. Air represents analysis and illuminating perspectives, beliefs, ideas, and values, the mental body. Fire represents alignment with one's dharma, the causal body. And space represents unity consciousness, interdependence, and from which the other four elements emerge, the Buddhic body. As we come to the conclusion of our journey through a metaphysical and cosmic framework, we see an unfolding of consciousness, a little bit, as I imagine, like a flower blooming. We've learned that we are multidimensional beings, energy expressed as form. In the landscape of discovering who we are, we could imagine that each of us has a unique blueprint and master plan for the overall evolution and trajectory of our growth. This is where we come to understand that life purpose is an energy in the same way that the soul is energy. Life purpose or dharma is unique to each person. It's a way forward in your learning and growth, a path. I love Annie Besant's insight, which is if we think of dharma as an evolution, then it makes sense when she says the law of the next stage of its unfolding. In other words, each of us is more than any label that we could assign, and our task is to live from a place of joy, which is the radiant light of the soul. When we move beyond our habitual mode of thinking, we move beyond the limitations of the ego personality. We realize we are so much more with tools, resources, both inner and outer, and insight that's available to us. This leads us to greater self-understanding and personal growth. And from this flows more inner peace and joy rather than pain and suffering. And we see that every person desires the same happiness as we do, which leads us to compassion and tolerance, kindness for ourselves and others, and expands our self-boundaries a little more to be in union and harmony with all other beings. I'd like to conclude this presentation with something that Annie Besant wrote. It has brought Annie Besant's wisdom into my life, and I hope that you find as much joy and insight in it as I have. O hidden life, vibrant in every atom. O hidden light, shining in every creature. O hidden love, embracing all in oneness. May all who feel themselves as one with thee know they are therefore one with every other. Thank you so much for joining me today.